And thank you all from me and Tia, and we're going to light the blue touch paper, and we'll be seeing you all next year with some big surprises.
And we're also lighting the blue touch paper with this first episode of Something Who. We're going to be discussing two stories, one from the classic series and one from the new, which have a linking theme. And to start us off, it's the Macra Terror from Season 4, recently released in animated form, and Gridlock from Series 3, proving that there really is such a thing as Macra. So joining us this evening, all the way from Australia, we have Mike.
Hi.
Mike, hello.
Hi, how are you, Richard?
Yeah, spiffing.
Oh, that's great.
Just back from holiday, so spring in my step. Glad to have you at the birth of the new podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Richard.
Excellent. Also joining us, fresh from his first outing on the Grumpcast, it's Simon.
Hi. Hello, Richard. Hello again, fellas.
Hey, Simon.
You've been basking in that fame, presumably, over the last couple of weeks.
Oh, if only, Richard, if only. I was waiting for the Easter eggs to arrive with all the fan mail.
Very good. And Giles, you're with us. Good to have you on Something Who.
Yeah, live via 2 tin cans and a piece of string from Wapping.
Yeah, and especially since it was your idea in the first place.
Can't blame you for everything, surely.
And finally, Paul.
Yes, finally. Last but very much least.
Never. I mean, I know how much research you've painstakingly done, so we're glad to have a man of your of your expertise.
I have at least one original observation to make, see that nobody else is qualified to make. You just wait for it.
Ooh.
It may be disguised as a plug, but it's also an observation.
Oh, okay.
Very good.
3-pin or 2-pin?
Bar.
So you may have noticed that Simon and I, on very much a podcast from this stable, but nonetheless somewhat rival podcast, have already had something to say about the Macra Terror and the animation. So I thought it would be good to throw open as we start to the remaining three. So of course, in Something Who, it's mainly about the story and about the two stories and about comparisons. But since we've just had the Macra Terror released as a DVD and an animation, certainly, if you've got something relevant to say about that, it'd be interesting to hear what it is.
Wouldn't it? I've got to be careful here. I don't want to tread on anyone's toes. I don't want to repeat anything you said in the other podcast. And do you know what? I haven't had time to listen to your sterling work either of the times you recorded it. So, but I'm going to be boring and say I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was the most fun I've ever had watching the Macra Terror. So I was delighted.
Very good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I thought they'd done a pretty good job of it. Some debatable animation choices aside, I don't object to them. Sprucing up the Macra.
Obviously, they shouldn't have cut that scene out, and Charles Norton should be hung, drawn, and quartered and dragged through the streets of London. But apart from that, it was brilliant. I say that as a friend.
Well, it's interesting because I went to the screening and I was discussing with someone afterwards. I'm not sure whether it's it's fair enough to mention the name Derek Handley here, who is obviously famous for working on the recons and so on. And he wasn't so much. It wasn't intended as a slight towards that or anything like. He wasn't being dismissive of it, but we were just talking about it, and he was saying, well, it must have been a very simple setup the way they did that in the studio at the time, because they know enough to know it was done in the studio as part of a recording as live. So pretty much all they could have done was put Troughton into a box and had some dressers in there who very rapidly changed his clothes while he was standing in there, and he stepped out. So it's not like it was anything that doesn't feel like it would have been anything that was incredibly difficult to animate necessarily.
Well, no, I am unconvinced that it would have needed much more than drawing a slightly rumpled coat for Patrick Troughton, which would have probably taken the esteemed Mr. Geraghty 20 minutes. But as Charles Norton is the new Walt Disney, who am I to argue? If his spreadsheet said no, they couldn't afford it, then I'm sure that's correct. It's not just because he has no sense of humour and doesn't think that frippery has any place in Doctor Who. It's not that at all.
And they didn't dance off stage at the end either, did they? But I can appreciate that would have been a more tricky. That would have been a more tricky setup to have actually animated potentially. But the clothes revivifier or whatever it was called was yes, disappointing loss.
Yeah, can I just say that I'd actually like to thank Charles Norton because watching Macra Terror was probably like watching the Macra Terror here in Australia in 1967 with bits of it cut out. So it was like an experience that he was making an experience for.
It's an homage to
So thank you, Charles. Thank you very much.
the cartoon produced in association with ABC Television. Well, maybe they'll find the missing bits of cartoon in your books in 35 years' time.
Yeah, it'll end up on Lost in Time, the cartoon years or something. Yeah.
Along with the famous milk scene from Sharda.
Yes. I hated the colour, by the way, but then I always do. But anyway, we won't go into that. There are bits of it that I thought was okay, and there's bits that I didn't like, which I will mention as part of the story, because it's relevant to the story, because I don't want to go into much about the actual animation itself. But I don't know what's going on with poor old Polly. She never looks like Polly. And maybe third time, when they do the faceless ones, that they might actually get Polly and Ben right, which would be good. Anyway, moving along.
Well, unless they take the cue from the title.
Yes.
Yep.
True.
Okay, so perhaps in that case, having briefly discussed the animation, if we then maybe get into discussing Macra Terror as a story and what we got from watching it via the animation, or indeed the telesnaps, if that was how you consumed it. Who was to kick us off with thoughts on the Macra Terror?
Well, my general thought was that my first experience of this story was from the audio, and I saw the recon, the loose cannon one, and then when I was watching it, it became apparent to me there were certain elements of it that I hadn't really picked up on before, mainly how bloody noisy the thing is. And I think that's because when you're listening to it or you're watching looking at the telesnaps, you actually form some kind of picture in your mind, and you're actually moving along, and you've got sort of an idea about how the story goes, and you're concentrating on that, and you don't sort of notice some of the other stuff. And I noticed that I had a chat with Simon about this early on when he'd seen it, and he sort of wasn't overly keen on the whole story, and I thought he was just being unnecessarily harsh, years of watching Arsenal managed by Arsene Wenger and stuff like that. But what happened was that, and then I saw the thing, and it became apparent how it is really, really noisy. Like that Tannoy voice is very persistent and quite annoying after a while, and the alarms are going off constantly, and it's really quite distracting when everything's sort of there for you, and it's not the animation's fault at all. It would probably be the same if I was watching it, if the episodes had actually been found, which they haven't. Yeah, I just found it really sort of distracting and annoying. Certain other elements as well, like the character of Barney, who I think, I don't know what it is about the Troughton years, but every season seems to have one character who's extremely annoying. It reached its zenith in season 5 with Evans, who's probably more irritating than anybody in the whole of Doctor Who put together. It's certain elements of that. I found it a bit distracting with the noise and stuff, and I don't know how everybody else felt if they listened to it beforehand and that sort of distraction, and not a lot happens.
Do you know what? I as you asked, that you did ask, but if perhaps you didn't actually expect an answer. I did have an observation to make about the sounds. The sounds. Yeah. I hadn't spotted before watching it as a cartoon that it seems emblematic of there are a lot of jingles and things which I can see you found annoying. But if you put that aside, there's a lot of atmospheric sound effects here that I only really noticed because there were long dialogue-free scenes.
Yes.
Where, if it weren't for these rather atmospheric non-naturalistic
Yes.
sound effects. They were sort of halfway between music and actually textural sound effects. You weren't quite sure. And so whooshing and wind noises and rustling sounds.
Yes.
But clearly radio workshop stuff. And I thought if they hadn't put that in the soundtrack, this would be deathly dull to watch.
Yeah, true.
And it made me appreciate all over again just how extraordinary the sound effects are and how unique they are in 62. It also made me wonder when they stopped doing that. I associate it with the black and white years. My own personal marathon has just reached early Pertwee, and I don't feel like the stories have... I guess as the incidental music rises in importance in this show, the sound effects drop back to only ever representing specific things that we see happening, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It goes alongside the music. There's a certain clumsiness to the way the music's edited. There'll be a scene with no incidental music whatsoever, then they'll cut to an action scene or a tension scene, and the music will click in immediately, and then stop again as soon as you cut back. And
Yes.
Again, a slightly clumsy technical way of editing, which I associate with the 60s, and by the time you get to the 70s, we're into the era of music flowing on between scenes and being treated a bit more subtly. So that's just it is in some ways part of the technical making of the show, but it also adds to the atmosphere, and it was something I hadn't spotted until I saw it go. It almost felt like it was designed to go along with a cartoon. It was interesting.
Yeah, the bit that I thought was quite impressive in the whole thing, where the animation and the sounds really did sort of mesh really well, was the bit with the old bloke, the controller, and the claw. I thought that was really quite effective, and that bit, and the sound and everything really sort of did mesh really well with that sort of scene. You can almost hear the Tannoy, the Macra in the background going, "Get that claw out of shot! Get that claw out of shot!" That type of thing. But yeah, that's one of the sort of incongruous parts of the whole story. Is the Macra are trying to keep everything secret, yet they allow themselves to be shown quite easily as part of that scene when they're actually showing that everything's okay, which is kind of odd. And I had some sort of issues with the story itself, which I always have, really, I suppose. But it became more apparent just sort of seeing it on the screen. And that's no fault of the animation, in my opinion. That's the actual story itself.
Also picking up on this thing about the sound, I mean, I had almost the exact reverse scenario to what you felt, Mike. That I found the audio CD and recons to some extent. I don't think I've ever actually tried to watch it on a recon, but I certainly listened to it on audio a few times from. It was released on audio tape, wasn't it?
Yes.
Back in the day.
Yes.
And
Yeah, it was.
so I remember listening to it on tape and then on the CD, which is still a cleaned up version. And basically the wall of sound effects and so on, and the lack of dialogue, I found it one of the most unlistenable. I found it basically unlistenable until, to say nothing of Colin Baker's dialogue as scripted by JNC. But I found basically it was one of the ones I struggled most with on audio, and I felt that actually having a visual representation of what was going on, I found that worked better, and the soundscapes and so on worked quite well in that context, which I think was what Paul was sort of getting at. Although I did feel that there's a very strange thing, and it really took me out of it when I watched it. I was at the BFI for the premiere screening, as it were, and it really took me out of it at the time. And then I sort of went and researched it and realised that it must have been a strange production issue with the original, which was after they materialise, that the whole sound goes echoey, and I thought, well, hang on, this must be intended to be shot in a cave or interior shot, and yet there was this strange jarring thing between the TARDIS, I believe, materialising on a hilltop in the filmed insert that they did with Medoc running around, and then the TARDIS crew exit into a studio set where they're suddenly surrounded by rocks that aren't visible in so they're sort of in a rocky canyon or something like that, which is completely invisible in the shot where the TARDIS materialises, at least according to what I can make out from the telesnaps. And I spent about 5 minutes being really annoyed by this echoey sound and thinking, why have they shot it as outside and when it must be the interior with all that reverb on it. And then, I looked at it and thought, okay, no, they've just matched it up to what the real experience would have been like. But it's odd.
Yeah, I mean, I was really looking forward to this animation because of the fact, as you say, Giles, it's pretty hard work trying to follow it on the CD version. But sadly, I found myself, drifting off and falling asleep in one or two of the episodes. I admire the effort that they've done with the animation, but I just didn't find the story as compelling as I'd hoped.
No, it's not. That's the problem.
Perhaps we want to discuss the story and what we make of that.
I'm sad to hear that because I'm very fond of it, and I think it's a story that I've only enjoyed more every time I've been exposed to it. I was going to ask if we think it's generally underrated by the fandom at large, and it sounds. I think we can assume it is if our panel's anything to go by. I was a bit hard on Ian Stewart Black's other stories. I think when I would discuss the Savages on another podcast. In another place recently, Tim had to talk me up on it because I found it very dull. It had some nice ideas and a few interesting moments, but I just generally found the treatment and the characters and the dialogue just rather drab. He wasn't that keen on the War Machines either, despite my attempts to paint it as a precursor to everything that was to come in 70s Who. But here, there are ideas. It takes the traditional Doctor Who Base Under Siege story, which by this point wasn't traditional. It gets in. It gets in as one of the first of those stories and subverts it, which is interesting because then the year after we get a non-subverted, a straight telling of this same story again and again and again. It's the specifics of the telling, the humour, the campness,
most of that's gone now.
That appeals to me.
I found it pretty dull, unfortunately, Paul. I think it suffers from a lack of strong characters other than the TARDIS crew, really. There are some very good actors in roles in it, but I don't think the parts were written well enough for them, and unfortunately the Macra themselves are pretty underwhelming. Apparently they've got strong hypnotic powers and they've taken over this entire colony, but I mean, if there's a natural gas there anyway and they've been living for hundreds of thousands of years, it all seems a bit pointless, unfortunately.
I wouldn't disagree with you there. I don't think the characters are particularly three-dimensional at all, and the story is nothing special. But it's not very good science fiction. It's rather silly if you take a step back and look at it seriously. But
kind of that with Doctor Who.
What I like, it's more of a fairy tale style, but not in the same way that a lot of say Hartnell stories are more fairy tale-y than science fiction. Not in a sort of Web Planet sort of way. I don't know. I'm finding it hard to explain here. It's not quite a satire or an allegory, but it is clearly just being approached from a different angle than standard Who. I'm giving it
Butlin's holiday camp.
I'm giving it points for that.
I think that's the strong part of it, Mike, and Paul as well. All is not what it seems on the surface. Everyone's happy, and there's that holiday camp atmosphere, and that could have been a lot more interesting, and that could have been explored a bit better.
Yes.
Bring us back to those jingles that annoyed Mike so much. I feel like it's doing a similar sort of thing to the Happiness Patrol all those years later, and slightly more successfully. Yeah. Without dragging this review into a review of a completely different story, one of the things that never quite worked for me with the Happiness Patrol is the fact it was clearly supposed to be a very bright, shiny, colourful... Not everyone agrees with me on this. I always assumed that the script was asking for a bright, shiny, colourful, mall-like atmosphere, and the design department went with something rather different and made it look rather drab. But everything that story was trying to do, I just feel comes across slightly better here.
Yeah, my point was not so much the jingles. It was the incessant, the tannoy voice, which is incessant most of the way, and the alarm sound. To me, this is the first time I've ever really noticed it.
Were you listening to it on a pair of very expensive headphones or something? I'm not. Maybe you should get
these Bose things. This is what does it. You see, yeah. When they work, of course.
I think it's interesting what you say about the actors. That that's obviously something that sadly we inevitably have to lose when we look at any kind of reconstruction, whether it be telesnap or animation. But obviously, yes, you've got some quality actors there, and in particular Peter Jeffrey, who you would think is someone who would make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and would be undoubtedly watchable more than perhaps more than he is just listenable when that's all you've got to go from. And obviously we lose masses of Troughton business into the
and the chap who plays the main baddie, what's his name? I'm not going to
the security chief guy.
Ola.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ola.
Anyway.
Gerton Klauber.
Yes, he's good, and that's what I would have said.
Yes.
So okay, I should have just gone for it, shouldn't I? Yeah, he would have added value. I think he would.
Yes.
He's got a very expressive face,
Yes.
which comes through in the animation as well. So I think the actors do it enough justice. Peter Jeffrey gives us another. Well, he's not really the villain here, is he? But he gives us another subdued, sympathetic villain performance to rank alongside the androids of Tara.
I don't think you could call Count Grendel of Drak subdued.
No.
No.
Oh, it is. It's a masterpiece of understatement.
The sound, you talked about the sound earlier. I mean, the production values of Doctor Who get mocked. I mean, the Macra props in the original are pretty awful, but the sound in Doctor Who, that's always been cutting edge, and they almost feel the need to make it sciencey, having all those sound effects. But the huge irony is that here in the present time and moving onwards, life and technology is getting quieter and quieter, isn't it, with electric cars and microprocessors and things like that. But in all those futuristic sets back in the 60s, you always had to have whirring computers and things like that making lots of noise to make it sound futuristic. And it's the same as well with that colony.
Would anybody like to help me try and bottom out what the story is about? Because if we're going to compare and contrast with Gridlock, we can't really just talk about the production values. So let's. I've had trouble, but I tried to make a start. What do we think it is? Like I said, I don't feel like it's a satire, quite, or an allegory. But what is it? It's one of those vaguely dystopian future style things. Mrs. Paul Morris, who sat next to me watching it, I doubled down on the research this time. Not only did I watch it, I actually got somebody else to. So, just to make up for all those previous occasions. I think she made the obvious comparisons to 1984, and I brought in my favourite trick, which is but what about Brave New World? Yeah. I do like the flip side, the yin and yang of 1984 and Brave New World, the two different dystopian futures, the authoritarian version and the future in which we sleepwalk. Which the Brave New World version, which I think is close to the real world, where we've happily surrendered our freedoms, happily given over our private lives. I think it's an interesting mixture of the two, but it's clearly, for me, it's close to the Brave New World and I think that's where the holiday camp atmosphere comes from. It's giving the masses entertainment. So they do have literal drugs. Hypnotic voices in the night, hypnotic drugs being pumped into the room, but also just, I think, generally the idea that they are being kept passive by being entertained. Yeah,
this is sort of
to death.
It's like the prisoner in the village
well, this
setting
is the
as
whole
well.
thing,
Wasn't the Manchurian Candidate? That was the early 60s as well. It's not like 1984 or Brave New World, but brainwashing was very topical and all the rave in the 60s, wasn't it? And lots of things.
But
those goddamn
the prisoner thing in particular it's obviously the comparison has been drawn before, but you can't help but think, okay, there's something they're getting out there, that it must have been something that was in the zeitgeist about that, because two dystopian holiday camp kind of environments. And interestingly enough, I found out I too did some actual research for this, at least as far as looking up Ian Stuart Black's resume, and I saw he was actually executive producer and writer of some of Danger Man. So I did wonder, although admittedly only so far as IMDb can tell you, and obviously anyone can put anything on that, probably only in about 1960 in the first series of Danger Man. Unfortunately for the theory that, because I did think, well, did we go and see this? Did this part, because frankly, that the opening scene in particular, the whole thing with Medoc, frankly, all it needs is a giant rubber ball bouncing after him, and And it would come straight out of the prisoner, those first 5 minutes of weirdness.
Peter Jeffrey is our new number 2.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And the whole thing, and again, disembodied tannery voices, people not being who they say they're going, who they say they're going
Absolutely.
to.
Yes.
The control, the face of control on the wall. I mean, there may be another antecedent, but it reminds me of the face of Big Brother, which is throughout 1984, and which is also pastiche in Inferno.
Yes.
I'm watching at the moment. I don't know anything about Ian Stuart Black as a writer, so if I were to hazard a guess, which obviously I'm going to, he just gives me the impression of one of those non-science fiction writers who's been tasked with writing what he would assume is supposed to be science fiction. And across those 3 Doctor Who stories he does, he takes a slightly different angle each time, which is one of the main things I find interesting about it. A lot of writers, some very good writers, fall flat on their faces because they panic at the thought of writing science fiction. They think they either write very bad pastiche science fiction, or they come in with ideas that they think are going to be extraordinarily original without knowing that they're hackneyed. It can go wrong in so many different ways.
The Ian McEwan approach, as it's known.
I think this is his most successful because unlike with the War Machines, I don't know. I was going to say the War Machines, he just threw in some mad giant robots, but I suppose just throwing giant crabs in. Can I mention the crab-stroke-insect dilemma here? Well, I gather that the script originally referred to insects, and that was what the writer had in mind. And presumably fairly late in the day, possibly only on the day when Shawcraft models rolled up and showed them what they'd come up with. Somebody panicked and went through the script with a red pen, writing crab in. They should have been crossing out insects and replacing it with a crab, but for some reason they don't. For some reason, every time somebody refers to an insect, they say "or crab." They've left the original line of dialogue and then added "or crab" at the end of it, which is hilarious the first time, and it just gets better and better.
No.
If I'm ever a script editor, that's how I shall approach the task. Trying to find a compromise between the writer's vision and the production realities, which satisfies no one.
Well, if they just use the word arthropod throughout. Yes, Ian Stuart Black seems to have done a variety of novels and things, military stuff. Apparently he had a couple of films produced, one of which was about the Cyprus emergency situation. He was story editor on Sir Francis Drake, one of those good old 60s adventure serials. Seems to have had a mixed career. I think that would be the best. Probably coming into it from a military background, I think.
Interesting. Does anybody have any memories of his 3 novels? Because he's one of those lovely 60s writers who was still around in the 80s and wrote their own novelisations, didn't he?
No.
I remember being taken by... I'm pretty sure I was fairly taken with the War Machines novelisation when it was out.
I do. That's the only one of the 3 I remember, and it's not just because he writes in Chesterton, though obviously that's always
of course, yes,
over.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They were a bit too late for me. I think I'd given up with the novels by the time those ones came out.
Yeah, same with me, I think, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I should have remembered that we had to ask our resident OAP.
One point I want to make about the animation and where it sort of fell down for me was the bit in the forbidden area, which I had in my mind this tense sort of realisation that it was very dark and tense, and when I saw it in the animation it's sort of wide and expansive and quite well lit, and you have sort of have Medoc sort of swanning about, like he's auditioning for Strictly Come Dancing, which is known as Dancing with the Stars here, and that sort of thing. And then Jamie sort of swanning about, he's sort of like sashaying around like he's just walked off the set of a 10cc film clip. And the character movements there are particularly disappointing. And I think a lot of the tension is sort of lost, particularly in the early part, because of the way it's portrayed on screen. And you sort of think, well, yeah, it's okay. And then Medoc suddenly disappears and Jamie gets cornered, and that bit's quite good. But the lead up to it it just seems a bit lacking in tension, as far as I could tell. It didn't come across very well at all.
So I think what we'd find if we ever were able to see the original stories is that it would be, much better and much worse than the animation simultaneously.
Well, it'd be really, really dark for a start, so you couldn't see the prop.
Yeah.
You're complaining that set was too big, but of course, it would have been absolutely tiny, and the actors would have been...
Yes, but it's a mine shaft, so it would have been
struggling.
kind of claustrophobic, which you don't get that impression.
Don't make excuses for Riverside Studios. I don't know, and the reason they did that in the animation was partly, I suppose, with my direct insight into Charles Norton's brain. I guess they like to make the sets look bigger whenever they can, which you're right, may well be just intrinsically wrong if you take the purist point of view. But it was also to fit more Macra in. They could. The Macra were probably bigger than Ian Stuart Black imagined, whatever the hell he was imagining. Bipedal insects, and you got flat, lumbering giant crabs, which do stretch one's credulity as to how they would have set this whole thing up. But let's not go there.
I was just going to say one other point of reference that suddenly occurred to me was Quatermass and the Pit. In terms of here we have insects and mind control, or insectoid mind control stuff going on as well, and I wonder whether that might have been...
Well, it would definitely be in the back of anybody's mind. Any non-science fiction fan who was struggling to think of an example of science fiction would have Quatermass and the Pit in the back of their mind, wouldn't they? So, yeah, almost certainly. Yes, I did, actually, it's a good point. When I was idly mulling what precisely Ian, I'm going to call him Ian now, Ian had in mind, on the assumption it wasn't giant crabs, yes, they did pop into my head, those peculiar little beasties from Quatermass and the Pit.
I don't know. It's not really a Reds Under the Bed story, is it? Or I don't know. It's very hard to pin
I
down.
don't think so, because they normally tend to be really obvious, like the aforementioned web planets. I think it's... I was going to say cleverer than that, or it could be more stupid than that. It could be that he didn't actually have an angle on this, but that's okay. Are there any topics we haven't covered yet? What topic would the lead Macra come under? The control Macra. He's my favourite character. He's so hysterical and camp. He's fantastic. He's the best villain in the whole of the 60s. And
The giant crab. Yes.
I'm going to keep pushing this until you all love it as much as I do.
Go on.
There's something about the production which I think is in sympathy with Ian Stuart Black's story, with Ian Stuart Black's themes, what the specific angle he's taking, whatever that was. If I think the director gets it. Who's the director?
Oh, he was a one shot.
He's not one of the classics, is he?
No, not
Yeah.
John Davis. He was actually there he was actually there at the BFI thing, but sadly didn't really. They only talked to him for about 2 minutes. They just got him to stand up in the audience, and he...
Is he on the commentary? Does anyone know?
Ooh, he really didn't appear to remember all that much.
I haven't listened to the commentary, but Tim did. I think John Davis turned up in a Toby Hayter Who's Round or something like that, but he wasn't specially interviewed, I think, for this.
Now, I may not have to credit him. I could just credit the voice actor who played Control, because I don't want to keep saying Control. Is that what they called him? The voice of not the old man on the screen, but the voice of the lead.
Yes.
Because there's something interesting going on there. He's clearly written as hysterical. The slightest opportunity, the lead Macra flies into a panic. It's very rarely, there are no such things as Macra. There are no such things as Macra!
Which, to be fair, is quite suspicious. You'd start to think,
Yeah.
methinks he does possess too much.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain! which I but I mean, he does get completely hysterical and is throwing hissy fits all over the place towards the end. I love that.
Is that another reference, actually? Is it a Wizard of Oz story?
Well, it's probably one, isn't it? It's another fantasy for non-fantasy people. It's got to be in the mix somewhere. I apologise for shouting. You're going to have real trouble with that in the edit, aren't you?
It'll be great.
Look at your little face.
Looking forward to it already.
I just think Macra Terror can be summed up as a story about where the Doctor cures a bunch of jolly hockey stick colonists of a bad case of the crabs, really.
Oh. Can I hold up the satire sign?
So you've sort of got about two or three things going on at the same time, haven't you? You've got the same idea, I suppose, as the brains of Morphoton from
yes.
from
Oh,
Keys
yeah.
of Marinus. So you've got this idea of, okay, people perceive it to be fantastic when actually it's a bit dire. You've got this sort of satire on happy clappy, get people singing a happy tune while they work and maybe they'll feel better about it alongside it. And then you've also got the kind of holiday camp thing as well. And it feels like this sing a happy tune when working, holiday camp and perception altering are sort of all working together, but not necessarily quite together, slightly at cross purposes at times, but they're all there in the mix.
Is this at the peak of the holiday camp era, the hidey-high times, the working classes going off and they're jolly for a week, entertained by yellow coats, and then they're back at work again for the other 51 weeks of the year?
It's a wee bit late for that, I think.
I would have thought so,
Right.
yes. Yeah.
But it would have. The colonists are working for the Macra, so it could be. I can't think of any other possible satirical angle other than it's a class. Maybe Ian Stuart Back was right. It was aimed for a class to foment class war. We are all working for the Macra in our own way, ladies and gentlemen. Rise up and overthrow your crab overlords.
Well, you could say the Savages has started similar themes in that regard, doesn't it? I suppose.
Yes.
If the Savages are about class rather than race, but they intersect. We should steer clear of the politics because I should, because I don't know what the hell I'm talking about.
Simon, any other thoughts? We haven't heard you for a little bit.
I'm sure it's coming across to people listening, but it's really not one of my favourite stories, unfortunately, Richard. I admire Paul's spirited defence and looking for things of interest in it, but honestly, it's 3 episodes too long for me.
Oh my god!
Okay.
I think I like the space. I think I like the space pirates better than the Macra.
That's a big call.
Okay. One question though, to everyone: what do you think about the distribution of the Doctor and companions, the team, and in particular, is this obviously we've just come off the back of reviewing a season of Doctor Who, in which one of our common refrains was that they just weren't funny enough for the having a crew of 3 companions to deal with. Is this a story that's where they are struggling in that regard? Do we feel, or do we feel they're well distributed?
I can't put. It felt okay to me. I can't put my hand on my heart and say that it wasn't written for 2 companions, and that it's possible Jamie and Polly, don't have enough individual strands to justify 2, but it gets points for me just by giving something new for Ben to do.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. And also, I think this is the first story in which Jamie actually has anything to do.
Yeah.
apart
The mine
from
scenes are
Islanders. Yeah.
the mine. Sorry, Mike. The mine scenes are one of the strongest elements of it, and it gives Jamie license to show off what he can do. Bit of heroicism, if that's such a word.
It's a bit of a nail in the coffin for Ben as a character. It's completely not his fault that he's the one who falls victim to the baddies.
No.
But it reminds one of Adric in season 19, and what it just sort of leaves a lingering feeling that it makes the character. You have slightly less sympathy for the companion subconsciously, and
And
I'm a bit
Mike
worried
Yates
about that.
as well. Yes.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
indeed, yeah. I mean, I was going to say Mike Yates, I have this kind of worry that you get this, and then in the next story you've got the faceless ones, and you got more kind of possession and mind control, and I wonder if then, having left the TARDIS crew at the end of that, he disappears off and joins Operation Golden Age or something like it. I mean, he's sort of ripe for being in a bad way.
who's going to be the first to suggest that Big Finish looks into that in a sarcastic tone of voice? Because we have a new Ben, so who knows? What could he have been? He could have been in the background of all sorts of things during the 70s.
Yeah, I think we have an emissary to into the Big Finish scene. I think there's certainly an angle for you there, Paul, if you're remotely interested.
Cool. I'll get straight on it. See ya.
Yeah.
Oh no, tell you.
So let's talk about Gridlock. So interestingly, when we first talked about this, I thought Gridlock, Macra. I mean, clearly there's a very tenuous connection between the two. And actually, when I watched Gridlock for the first time, I thought RTD's just kind of dumped the crabs into Gridlock, and it it's a nice reference to the past, but it isn't particularly relevant. But actually, as I watched Gridlock, I started to see some of the same themes from Macra Terror start to assert themselves. I guess particularly with the mood enhancers or whatever in some of those early scenes.
Yes.
So perhaps there's a better overlap than perhaps I'd imagined.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's exactly what I thought
Mm.
earlier this evening. 13 years after I first watched it, I finally realised why Russell put them in there, and I realised I should never have doubted him. Not that I doubted him; it was all the other fans that doubted him. But yeah, you're right. They are both. They don't have the same atmosphere. They are both taking science fiction and approaching it from a playful point of view, perhaps.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely no coincidence that he chose this particular random monster to bring back and put into that story, which again I only realised rewatching Gridlock in the run-up to this, coming to it post-Macra, as it were. I've watched Gridlock many times before, and I've often cited it as my all-time favourite Doctor Who story, to be honest, because I find it so rich in allegory, and it's just so adventurous. It pushes the bounds of what I think Doctor Who can do. Yes, I understand that some fans will take against it because it's not entirely meant to be taken literally. But watching it after having recently watched the Macra animation, very much I came to it with a whole new level of sort of insight and appreciation. I thought, okay, that's yet another. It's operating on yet another level beyond the ones I'd already noticed.
It was very nice. I hadn't watched it since broadcast, and coming back to it again, and we went through Series 13, and then I just watched the animation of Macra. Watching Gridlock, it was that good. It had so many layers to it, as you said, Giles. It was like watching a movie, and I felt like I'd watched a 4-episode story. There were so many different strands to it. I was really, really impressed. I'd forgotten. I know he's not popular with everyone, but I'd forgotten how good a writer Russell T Davies is.
Yeah.
And the Macra, I think, again, you didn't need the Macra in Gridlock, but I thought that was a very nice touch and a nod to the past.
Yeah, I agree with you, Simon, and it was exactly the same thought I had. I was in exactly the same place. I hadn't seen it since original broadcast. My view of it at the time was that it was quite slight, and I couldn't be more wrong. On watching it this time, I thought what a fantastic writer RTD is. What a lot of nuance there is in it, and how unlike some of the stories we've just endured in Series 11 that really lacked that good character writing and the various strands of plot.
There's something I didn't spot straight away when it was broadcast. One of the drivers of one of the vehicles, the pinstripe guy, I thought that's Max Normal from Judge Dredd.
Oh, that's right.
And then I did a little bit. I did a little bit more reading, and Russell T Davies is a huge Judge Dredd, and I presume 2000 AD and comic fan as well. And apparently, he based the Undercity on Mega City 1 in Judge Dredd.
Right.
So again, my appreciation of that story grows even more because I'm a huge fan of all that as well.
I don't know how much of it was in the script, but there's another visual element which I remember caused a lot of excitement when the first production photos were leaked, and it turned out to just be a purely visual motif. The couple at the very beginning who...
the American Gothic couple.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I remember people spinning on the forum, spinning vast fantasies about a story which had some debt to American Gothic, the famous painting.
Yes.
And it didn't.
I'd love to go through the whole... I was kind of taking notes on that, the people they go past, the doctor, the various vans that the Doctor jumps in and out of. You've got the man all in white with his row of white suits and his white drink and everything. You've got the Japanese manga girls.
Nudists.
You've got the nudists who appear to be Adam and Eve. And then you've got the red man below them. And then somewhere along the line you've got the wolf girl with her two blonde teenagers. So I'd love to work out. I'm sure that they are all references to various things, and I was thinking Magritte with the pinstripe man, but yes, Max Normal makes much more sense because I was comparing ties. Would you believe I was looking at images of Magritte bowler hat paintings and thinking, no, none of the ties match what he's wearing. But I'm sure there's stuff from the Garden of Earthly Delights and things like that in there.
And you know what I thought about Gridlock, watching it again, is how everything is better. I mean, the titles are so much better than much that we've seen since. That simple representation of the tunnel that appears, I guess, from Rose onwards. But it's rarely been bettered recently. The music, the title music again, I thought was probably as good a version as we've had in the new series. There was so much about it that at the time I don't know what I was doing. I think the first series when RTD came back, and maybe this is something to be hopeful about with Chris Chibnall, his writing wasn't kind of the best thing in it. You had the burping bins and the farting aliens. Most of the things in series 1 that RTD wrote were the less exciting ones. But by this point, it's really rich, and he's really on top of it, and there's a lot going on, and I can understand, Giles, now why you enjoy it so much.
Giles,
yes.
Can I put you on the spot and ask you to talk us through the allegory?
Oh, good Lord!
Because I like to hear clever people.
Well, obviously, one thing it has in common with with Macra is that both things are kind of stories about societies in denial in their own way, and we have this whole thing, yes, with the girl who goes and buys drugs so she forgets her family at the start and everything like that. The gridlock of the motorway is obviously I guess is an existential metaphor for life itself, which obviously a lot of people, and there's the line about the fact that they might travel 10 miles in 6 years. And at that point, I just wrote down the absurdity of that is absolutely the point of this entire story. That it's
like driving in central London, isn't it?
Yes, you're talking to someone who's just passed his driving tests.
Quite. On that very simple level, it's satirical, as in, wow, this is only slightly sillier than the things we actually put ourselves through. But yes, as Giles is saying, it's also slightly more to it. Everyone ascending to heaven at the end.
Yeah, yes.
Are they returning from hell to the real world? Are they returning from the real world? Are they ascending from the real world into
there's the whole
something?
That's the thing. I think it's too smart to it's one of those.
To tie itself down to one specific thing. It's not,
yes,
is it?
exactly. I think RTD. We know he's an avowed atheist and so on, but I think he's not a person of faith. But he's nevertheless interested enough and respectful enough, I think, of it to not absolutely hammer anyone over the head with a particular message about it.
A lot of great atheist writers are like writing about faith and people, because if you're a humanist and you're interested in people, then you're interested in why people believe things.
Yes.
Or you're interested in people who aren't like you. If you're a good writer, not just people who are like you.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it is an interesting point that with the faith thing. I mean, so at the very least, I guess what he's saying is that faith is important in that context, in the middle of the story, to giving people a sense of why should I keep going with this.
We keep on driving till the journey's end.
Yeah, but you feel that it's a bit more than that. I mean, it could be the happy clappy worky song from Macra in that place if it was just that. And you get the sense that the old rugged cross is a sort of nonconformist hymn. It's probably something from maybe a Welsh chapel that RTD's heard in his youth that kind of struck a chord. And while to some extent it's actually the core of the Christian faith, the cross and the symbol of forgiveness and restoration, nonetheless it'll be something perhaps from his childhood that he remembers as being perhaps either a happy place or something where he saw at least that people were taking strength and comfort from.
Think you know us so well, Doctor. We're not abandoned. Not while we have each other.
This is for all of you out there on the roads. We're so sorry. Drive safe.
Well, it's interesting. I watched it this time on out of sheer inertia. I actually watched it on Netflix because I happened to have Netflix on, and I thought I need to watch this, and I had subtitles on, and at the end of the old Ragged Cross bit, I think they described it as music fades into schmaltzy crescendo, as
Wow.
So it's the bit where Murray goes off,
Yes,
goes kind of off tune, just to give it a just at the end after the last line, and I thought yes, there is a point there that in some ways this thing is being given to them as a pablum, as it were, but on the other hand, and that seems to, the timing of that is that it jolts the Doctor out of his inaction, because that's the point at which he swings into action and decides he's going to go and rescue, get down there and rescue Martha.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is the thing, that although it's in some ways there's a thing about delusion, and and you could say, okay, and the fact you can't, no one's seen a policeman, as it were, for how many years they've been stuck down there, 20 years or something like that, apparently, and they are phoning the police and being put on hold, which I guess there's a fair metaphor there and things like that, possibly. But on the other hand, the whole thing is redeemed by the fact that the story absolutely hinges on Martha's faith in the Doctor, I think, and the face of Bo's and Novice Ames' willingness to sacrifice themselves in some ways to the face of Bo literally sacrifices himself. To save everyone. Yeah. And you had this thing, that the last thing that the city died of the bliss drug in 7 minutes flat, and the last thing they did was to seal off the Undercity. And they even say the people on the motorway aren't lost; they were saved.
Yes.
And yes, you have this thing, the face of Bo, and that's a very very obviously it's up there with Aslan in terms of kind of Christian metaphors. That he dies to save the city. So it's all about Martha's faith in the Doctor is what sees them through in the end. So yes, in some ways you're being led to believe, okay, the whole thing's, the faith these people have is a delusion that's keeping them going through an existential grind. But on the other hand, it's redeemed in the end. It's as indeed to some extent is the Doctor's own. The fact the Doctor's then rewarded with the message from Bo at the end, and obviously on another level, which who is it? There's a brilliant essay out there. I can't remember who wrote it, but he pointed out, of course, that the story also is about the Doctor and coming where it was in the series, and that the Doctor's just picked up Martha somewhat on the rebound and is deliberately kind of isn't revealing the truth to her, and it is about the Doctor getting past. He's gridlocked in his own way, and kind of reaches the end and is confronted about it and starts to move forward from the Rose thing, really.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that we actually get to it in the lyrics of Abide With Me at the end, but certainly there's a couple of lines in that which go, "Where is death's sting, where grave thy victory?" That perhaps are also relevant to the face of Bo, I suppose, or indeed the people earlier on who've sealed off the Undercity, that they have, in dying, they've managed to have an impact beyond their death.
But yes, I was going to say the fact it plays out on another hymn in the same way that has a completely different context that people are singing because they've been freed and they've been redeemed, if you like, if you want to talk in a kind of Christian sense. That was sort of their ascent and so on.
It's interesting because you might have said that Amazing Grace might have been more relevant at that point, but Abide With Me is kind of more elegiac. It's slightly melancholy, and perhaps actually it's suitable because it kind of cuts across slightly that atmosphere while still supporting it.
Yes, it's interesting. I think part of me, and because it's a few years since I've watched it recently, and part of me has kind of edited in Amazing Grace into the soundtrack at some point, possibly. But
yeah. I think we've stunned the others into silence.
It was beautiful.
One other thing, though, Sally Calypso in Control. Do you not think there's a similarity there? There's a parallel
definitely.
to be given. Again, you're getting holographic messages that are leading you to believe.
The role of the Macra in Gridlock, the big reboot of Doctor Who. Suddenly, you had real genuine cutting edge technology and CGI to do things with old monsters, and it was a scriptwriter's dream, really. But did someone look at the Macra and think, "No, there's not much we can really do with them. We'll just have them as mindless creatures underneath this motorway and all this smog, instead of making them more intelligent and menacing and making more of them using modern day technology."
That just comes from the script.
Yeah.
Russell, I think he said at the time that he needed a creature like that. He needed a creature that was living down in the dark, living on fumes and gas, and something in the back of his fan mind thought, "Oh, Macra," and obviously he realised that didn't quite fit with the way we saw them before, so he added a one-liner from the Doctor to say that was 5 billion years of devolution.
Is it the same planet?
No, he talks about how they controlled most of this galaxy at one stage. So
yes, that's right.
Again, he does that nice Holmesian thing of sketching out in just a line of dialogue a vast vista which you just get a glimpse of through time and space. Here we could have whole stories of Macra Empire. If in a different world, and possibly even in this world, if I get my way.
Another one for Big Finish.
If there's a role for Nick Briggs in it,
Nick Briggs can be very Camp Macra. Yes.
I mean, they are much, much, much larger than ones in the Macra Terror, but it's ironically they are close. The cartoon versions are moving in that direction. They are.
Yes. Well, I was thinking that myself, Paul. I thought perhaps the cartoon Macra were closer to the Gridlock one.
I think they've both taken the same decision. They've thought we can make them bigger and better than they were in 1967. Let's show Shawcraft models who's boss. It's the rallying cry of many creatives throughout history.
I also think the other difference between this and Macra Terror is that the effects are so much better, like the Macra, but also the makeup effects, like the cat makeup, is really excellent. The first time I saw it, I thought it was really good, and when I saw it again, I thought it's still really, really good. Like, you can make Ardal O'Hanlon look like a cat. Still sounds like Dougal from Father Ted, but he looks like a cat. So it's actually really, really, really good effects, and the skeleton effects is actually really quite good too. So the whole thing just seems much, as you pointed out earlier, that modern cutting edge technology, I think was what Simon said, is really apparent here in many ways, and it's not dark and gloomy like Macra Terror would have been to hide the fact that the prop's so bad.
Why does Martha seems to attract a fair amount of flack in fandom, but Giles' excellent overview of the story, she helped make it a really strong story, and she's a bit of a favourite of mine in this series as well.
I've got no problem with Martha as a character, the person. At the time, and I find my opinion hasn't changed, I really didn't like the whole angle of the way the Doctor treated her with his rebound from Rose. I thought that was a bit silly and distasteful, and I think he should be above those sorts of emotions, and I think it made him look a lesser being. It was rather silly. And she's not, I don't want to be unkind, I don't really like the acting choices that brought Martha to life. That's all I'll say.
With Martha, does she suffer from? I mean, I really like sort of contemporary companions in Doctor Who. Did she suffer slightly from being too close to being like Rose? I know she's a trainee doctor, but she comes across as very urban and trendy and hip and with it, a bit like Rose. Was she too similar to Rose, perhaps?
Rose, she's sandwiched between Rose and Donna, and Rose and Donna are both actresses playing working class, so they are slightly larger than life. I think Freema Agyeman is she's playing herself, isn't she? She doesn't seem particularly different in real life.
So I think it's a fair point that she's not necessarily all that credible as a trainee doctor, but I think given that that's not really a point of this particular story, I think she fits quite well into the story, and she's quite good at conveying that upset at the Doctor's behaviour and then calling him out, and then they have quite a good conversation at the end of it. So given the fact that there's no sense in this one that she's a medical student, I think it works reasonably well. I think I understand what you're saying, that across the season arc maybe she's less credible than she appears in this particular story.
I guess the only bit where she betrays her medical leanings, as it were, when she rips the drug patch off the pregnant girl's neck, which is
that's a good point.
a little sharp little moment where you think, yes, it's something. It comes across as something she has a very strong opinion about immediately. And it's a nice little touch, but for me, watching it reminded me, oh yeah, of course, trainee doctor, and it chimed with it. It feels like it's the kind of, yes, there's no other mention of that, and it's not really relevant to the story, but it's, again, without wishing to wail on the most recent season 11, series 11, again, it's the kind of little moments that we were kind of crying out for with regard to Yaz's character, and on several occasions we were thinking you could have put in a tiny little moment there that would have just reminded us of, and kept her character on brand, as it were. And that was, often the kind of thing that Russell was a master of. Yeah,
indeed. So, have we got any other observations that we want to make specifically on Gridlock, or do we want to then move on a bit more with the compare and contrast? So I think we've already said that there are quite a lot more similar themes than we'd originally imagined in terms of the two stories. I think it's fair from my point of view to say that I enjoyed Gridlock far more than I enjoyed Macra Terror.
It's a much better piece of work. I mean, you can't really deny that. My defence of the Macra Terror is more that it does more with the very basic juvenile format of 60s Who than some of its peers. So it's a mild defence. But compared to it, Gridlock's a work of art. But it has 50 years of progress to build upon. I'm not saying that Ian Stewart Black is no Russell T Davies, though obviously he isn't.
I was hoping that the Macra animation would completely change my valuation of the Macra Terror, just as I did with Enemy of the World when Philip Morris returned that. But so that's why I felt a bit let down when I sat through it. Whereas when I revisited Gridlock a few days ago, that was fantastic. I far more appreciated it when I saw it again than when it was first broadcast, and I think you'll be rewarded by rewatching that over and over again. I mean, Giles has inspired me to go back and rewatch it already, with some of those points he made as well about the religious themes running through it. That's something else to watch out for in it.
What about the character of the Doctor in Gridlock?
Can I just completely ignore what you said and ask about the character of the Doctor in the Macra Terror? Troughton's being slightly weird and shady, and not always doing the right thing in the moment, even though he ultimately comes out on in the same way that he does in a lot of his early stories.
He gets Medoc into a lot of trouble, doesn't he?
Yeah, basically kills him. But, well, no. It's odd. I think these early Troughton stories, a lot of the time he's just an anarchist, isn't he? Maybe that was they were trying to make him distinct from Hartnell in that sense, but you can't. It hangs over from the Power of the Daleks that once he's established, he's the first Doctor who arrives in a situation, and you ultimately know that he's there to fight the good fight and put things right. and yet he goes about it in a very peculiar way.
Hmm.
When do you think he loses that?
Ooh.
He's still being. His behaviour confuses Jamie and the evil of the Daleks. So by that point, Jamie
He does, yeah.
Well, and,
isn't expecting
and
his
Tomb,
whims.
he's completely off.
That's odd as well, isn't it?
Yes.
That's probably
Yes.
that's a bit of a return of it, and possibly for the last time. But yes, you're right.
But I think by the time
Can't
you get
think
to
of
Web an Enemy, he's
He was always like that.
Yeah,
he's more clearly
doctorish.
yes.
Irresponsible. Irresponsible. It only took me 20 seconds to think of the word. He's
The Macra is kind of closer to Power and Highlanders, I guess, whereas we've just had Moonbase, and actually in Moonbase, although he has his moments, when he's pulling off people's shoes and generally doing a bit of horseplay in episode 2. Generally in Moonbase, he's more like the archetypal Trout and Doctor from later on than in this.
And certainly
Macra
down the
Terror.
Water Menace.
I guess it's his methods ultimately. He delights in anarchy and destruction, like making an omelette by breaking eggs, doesn't he? He's just he's enjoying himself when he's ripping those control boxes off the wall, not just going about in a methodical way as Hartnell might have done.
Well, it's yes. Obviously, another thing is both of these stories are about. They're an example of that trope of story, that type of story in which the Doctor lands and creates a revolution overnight.
Yeah. It did feel very McCoyish to me as there's a thread that runs through this and McCoy to Kablam from last year.
Yes, yeah.
It's quite an attractive formula.
I think so. I enjoy that. Can I just ask, since everyone else has watched it recently, my recollection was, but there's a moment when Troughton's Doctor, as I recall, fairly unprompted, says, was it something scuttling or something insecty scuttling to he's questioning someone. I presume it's me, Doc, because nobody else will talk about the Macra. But I'm just trying to remember, because it struck me in the cinema, and I was thinking, have they cut something out? Did I just miss some moment when he was?
So, which moment are you referring to again?
I'm just trying to remember whether there's a moment.
Are you talking about in the first episode where the Doctor says
yes
they don't need to crawl across the ground?
Yes,
and meet,
yeah, that's it.
And
and
Peter Jeffrey says, "Why did you say that?"
Has he been given some?
I was slightly
has
confused.
Has he been given a cue
that,
to that beforehand by Medoc or someone?
Yes, okay. I think the only way that could make sense is if the Doctor is referring to what he saw in the TARDIS scanner at the end of the previous story.
Of course.
When they arrive, they're expecting giant crabs.
Yes.
So I think that's where that comes from. The bit that confused me is why the reaction is, why did you say that? As if, the people in charge, the Earth leaders, the colony, don't know about the Macra. And if they do, it's only some sort of subconscious feeling, surely. So why do they react? The whole there is no such thing as Macra. People who talk about Macra, people who talk about things scuttling in the night are subversives. Where does that come from? It doesn't really tie together to me. It's as if they do know these things are there and they're trying to cover them up. But at the end of the story, it's quite clear that nobody knows. They don't know what they're covering up or why these rules are in place. Oh, I'm talking myself out of liking it again now. What a shame.
I was just wondering because my initial thought before I thought about before you reminded me about the scanner screen was I was thinking, has the Doctor encountered the Macra before?
Oh, well.
Because
I do love it when you say things like this, because I get to write down in my
your big
in my
book
possible
of big
ideas.
Yes.
Yeah. Macra prequel by Paul Morris
And Giles Sparrow. Yes. You get me in that door somehow. Because I just was interested because Ian Stewart Black kind of has form for that in his other two stories. They both do involve kind of suggested backstory that we have the elders of the Planet of the Savages have been apparently the first Doctor Who fans to actually break through the fourth wall and make it onto television because they've been watching the Doctor's adventures for a few years. And in the War Machines, although they don't name drop Ian Chesterton, the Doctor is quite easily able to go and blag his way in because he's obviously known to these
It's
Mentally
similar but
speaking.
different. Because in those first two stories, yes, as you say, people welcome him. They don't. They not only do we not have that moment where he has to win them round, but they say, "Doctor Who, come in, Doctor Who. We know all about you. Come, how can you help us?" Whereas here, here he gets around that moment by just having the colonists being very welcoming.
Yes.
Initially.
But I just wondered whether there was a suggestion.
So the line in the script is, do they, for instance, appear to crawl slowly over the ground? So that could be, as you're suggesting, to do with that image of the crab creature.
But if there's
on
any
the
money in it
scanner
for
screen.
me, it will say that there was another story. Briefly. Now, on the subject of this, of the Doctor being an anarchic force, it almost strikes me that in some ways this story is designed for him. I mean, it may not have been. I don't know whether my mate Ian Stewart Black, came up with the idea after being told what the new Doctor's character was like. Who knows? But it's a story in which he can come in. The whole point is that he comes in and breaks all the rules, large and small, and that was why I think the erasure of the what's it called again? Rough and tumble. No, scene was controversial because it wasn't just a bit of frippery. It's the first sign that the Doctor cannot be controlled, cannot be numbered, boxed in, and so on. He's not a number; he's a free man.
Exactly.
It did make me think, of course I should have watched New Earth before I watched this, probably just to see how the two things connected.
At the time, I thought it was a bit disjointed in a way that it belonged to that subcategory of Russell T Davies stories where he would sometimes go all in for one idea, and then in a subsequent story that was a sort of sequel or semi-sequel to that, he would just overturn it, like with Harriet Jones. 1 minute she is going to be the presage of the Golden Age, and the next story he's decided to make her the villain because it just goes with his instincts. And we learned so much about New Earth, but then he kills them all off here, and it's not linked to anything that happened in the first story. It's not systemic failures in that society that bring about their downfall. It's just a new story he's telling set in the same place, which I think is why when that fabulous audio company Big Finish came to do their series of New Earth tales, which I think won awards across the board in 2017, we moved the story on slightly from Gridlock. It's the story of the second golden age of New Earth, where society has reformed, and we're now able to go out and to explore new areas of the planet without being tied to continuity.
And what fabulous writers did they have?
Oh, goodness me!
Contributing to that particular series.
There was the very excellent Roy Gill. There was TV's Roland Moore, creator of Land Girls. Very good. Some idiot called Matt Fitton. I see his name in a lot of things. I'm not quite sure what he has to do with it. Who's the fourth one?
Phil Morris.
Phil Morris, exactly, yes. It was probably Joanne writing under an assumed name because we know she has aspirations in that direction. Yes, Phil Morris. Phil Morris wrote The Skies of New Earth, which is set in the hitherto unexplored regions in the lower stratosphere.
Okay.
It doesn't bear too close examination from a scientific perspective, Giles.
Don't worry about that.
But it does have rocket pack wearing polar bears. And
excellent.
Yeah, sorry, you can cut this bit out, Richard.
You can't possibly cut out the rocket pack wearing polar bears. It's just they stay.
No. It's solidly part of the Something Who canon now.
Can I pretend that it wasn't a plug, and it's actually the whole thing is a tribute to just how rich the ideas were that we all thought that there was enough to explore, even though New Earth was only technically in 2 Doctor Who stories, 3 if you count The End of the World. The year 5 billion, you could call it. Genuinely, we thought that's something. I say we. They thought it was something worth exploring, and some of the more sceptic of our listeners brought their scepticism game to play when it was first announced, but it won quite a few people over.
So the Doctor in Gridlock is not obviously heroic to start off with, So he kind of storms into it thinking it's all going to be wonderful, like in New Earth. Not that it was always wonderful in New Earth, but he kind of he's a bit like he was at the start of New Earth, and then falls straight into trouble with that, and then he gets into a funk and a sulk, and is quite defeatist in the middle of it, and then of course he is a little bit heroic towards the end, and then he's called out by Martha, why are you hiding all this stuff from me? So he's quite a complex character in this story.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I'd agree with that. I'm not sure there's much to add. I think that's a good analysis of. This is the thing. I mean, Tennant's Doctor. Yeah, I found in terms of personal preference, I think series 3 is probably my favourite series in general of all of the recent of the revival of Doctor Who. I think. But I think yes, his mannerisms and so on start to get over-egged, and I think it's the one thing that gets to me about series 4 is just like I always felt like, okay, I can see this is absolutely firing on all cylinders, and Catherine Tate and David Tennant make a great team, but it just felt a bit by that point they were starting to write too much to Tennant's mannerisms and what he'd already brought to the role, and it felt like it was having the later series of Friends syndrome in terms of Tennant being all, oh, humans, oh yes, I love them, yeah, let me lick something. Whereas I think that's the kind of thing it's better if you leave it to the actor to do their own thing. I'm not quite sure how directly relevant that is to Gridlock, but I think this kind of catches him at the point before it starts to go over the top, definitely. And there's some interesting complexity in there. And the other story that it made me really want to watch after seeing the that end scene with him and Martha, beautifully played. All the stuff with Tennant. Again, it's one of those lovely things where you can do wonders. I think because you've got a fanboy in the role, channeling. So it's like channeling the Hartnell descriptions of Gallifrey, or the early stuff, and Pertwee, and they, and I think it made me think I really want to watch The End of Time now, just to see what his reaction is. Just to actually re-watch again for his reaction to actually getting Gallifrey back.
I remember some viewers were unconvinced, but thought there was some sort of discrepancy between his glowing remembrances of Gallifrey here and what we see. What we see it was in its final days, but and I think that is even referred to in The End of Time. As another one of those one-liners. He says that's how I'd like to remember it.
Yeah.
But with hindsight, which may or may not have been planned, but with hindsight, again, it fits with the tone of Gridlock, of the rest of Gridlock, doesn't it? The way his misty-eyed eulogising on the subject. It's more like it's a bit like an expression of faith in the idea of Gallifrey more than the reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's just remembering his childhood. I don't know.
We kind of half talked about it earlier on, but do we want to sort of have our concluding thoughts on the two stories?
In terms of summing it up, then you'll not be surprised to think that to learn that I think that Gridlock is an example of Doctor Who at its absolute finest, and in fact, it's one of those rare occasions where I'd say it's an absolute shining example of what television drama can do. Whereas Macra is it's a curate's egg. It's interesting. There's interesting stuff going on under the surface, but I'm just not sure whether it's one of those things where it would have been whether the Sasso would have been obvious at the time of broadcast, and we're just all missing something.
I think I've already said it. Really, I think it's works best when viewed in its context, rather than by comparing it to one of the best works by one of Doctor Who's best writers 45 years later.
Oh, well, that's the concept. This concept for a podcast buggered then, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's better.
Well,
it's better than the Underwater
I guess
Menace. So
True.
But we belied that. I guess, by our discussions last time when we talked about Series 11 and that came up unfavourably against some of the older ones. So, yeah, I think the format is sound. I think I'm still holding out hope that perhaps if we actually got the chance to see Macra Terror in its original form, it might, as Simon was saying earlier, it might benefit from that, and we might see it more in the light of Enemy of the World, with the little nuances and the acting business that is now lost and that can't come across in the animation, and that might elevate it a bit. It's never going to turn it completely from one thing to another, but we might find that elevates it a bit.
I think from this concept's perspective, it just shows that just because it's old and from the 60s and missing, it doesn't necessarily mean it's actually better than something that's come later in New Who. Like, people say that New Who's, none of it's any good, but that's not exactly true. And I think in this case that it doesn't compare favourably to Gridlock, because Gridlock is actually really good. And it's always going to struggle to do that because it's just not quite... Maybe comparing it to the Happiness Patrol may have been a better thing, but who knows? But I think that from a like-for-like thing, Gridlock is a much better story, I think, and I think that we all agree there. Like, we do. I know I've missed a bit.
And yet the people marketing the Steelbook saw fit to present it against Gridlock in that package. So,
yeah.
So there we go.
Mm.
Okay, look, I think I'm gonna bring things to a conclusion. I think we've had a good discussion there, and we're probably not going to get masses more out of it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our first episode of Something Who. We intend to run these roughly about once a month, and next time we're going to be doing Spearhead from Space and Rose. So please come back and listen to us talking about those.
I'm sorry, I can't see it. What's the? I thought they were supposed to have something in common, these stories. Okay, well, I've got a month to think about it, have I, and try and spot something. Okay, I'll get my thinking cap on.
But anyway, in the meantime, we've opened the roof, we've cleared out the fumes. It's time for Mike to head off into the sunshine, and for the rest of us probably to hit the sack. Although not, as been mentioned previously in the podcast, together.
That's just Tim's /fiction, isn't it?
Yeah. So until the next time, it's goodbye from us.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Yep.
Ta-ra.
Bye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Mike, did you manage to get all of your quips in that you hoped for?
Oh, most of them. Yeah, I just wish I had some chocolate eclairs to eat now.
We forgot to. Didn't we forget to cue Mike's opening joke?
No, that's all right. I decided to drop that one.
Oh, I was looking forward to it. Well, no, it wasn't it?
You weren't looking forward to it at all.
I can't lie to you. No, I wanted to know what it was.
I was going to have
Should we do it
have a
anyway?
mouthful, and I was going to say,
Don't tell us. Don't tell us. Oh. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was going to have my mouth
too late to
full.
do
It was
it?
like, no, it's all right. And I was going to pretend that I was eating chocolate eclairs because it's apparently hilarious. As a reference back to the scaffold, of course. Which was just so riveting.
Oh, yes.
I got put up to it by
Declares,
Mark from 42 to Doomsday. He said, you've got to get a chocolate eclair joke in there somewhere. So...
Does Mike sound like a Cyberman to everybody else, or is it just me?
Yeah, well, it's not going that well, but I think the recording that Mike said
Yeah,
should
the
be
problem is
fine.
that Google Hangouts has been playing up badly this morning. I've lost you about 15 times already today, I think.
Oh,
And you've been going,
well, we could go back.
You're sounding like Crichton from
We could go back
Red
to
Dwarf.
to oh, dear.
So you go, smear, smear. It's funny, actually. But then you just drop out. So anyway.
We can go back to Skype again if you're.
Well, if we want to keep Paul's computer crashing, yeah.
Oh, look, it was all right the last time. I don't know. It's just this morning. I think it's just.
Oh, we haven't.
It's our wonderful
Yeah.
Australian internet service.
And then we'll go straight in. So it's punchier. It's none of this monkeying about doing sketches at the start.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes. I was going to say something.
Are you
What was
hoping
it?
we'll get letters demanding, begging for the return of the sketches? Because we might. I think.
I have actually written the Five Doctors one.
Right.
Anyway,
Ah.
we,
We've
but
had
we
a
don't,
letter in the post bag from Mrs. Trellis of South Wales.
I know how much you love that. The sketches, so we won't bother with
I
that.
do.
We do, yes.
I just.
Just
Well, Paul's Mr.
Doesn't
Ambo
like
among
acting.
us, isn't he?
I love it too much. That's my problem. I don't know what that means. Sorry. Let's carry on.
Okay. So joining us this evening. Hang on. I'm sure I had something scripted for this.
Oh, dear.
Ah.
Okay.
Is it R?
Right. It's fine. Right.